I just feel that in 50 years' time, when we look back at the history of this movement, we're going to call it the dark ages of human relationships. I have asked many historians if in their expert opinion there's ever been a time where women have turned on their menfolk the way they have this century, or last century and this century, and they can't recount a time. It is inexplicable.
Hello and welcome to the show where I try and make a little sense out of this stunning and increasingly brave new world that we all live in by talking to a series of expert witnesses about their experiences, interests and concerns. It's important in life to be in touch with your feelings, but it's also crucial to be able to back those feelings up with facts. And so the purpose of this show is to push past purely personal or political promoting positions, separate fact from fiction and fake news headlines in the hope of uncovering important home truths. And today I'm talking Sense Not Sensibility with Erin Pizzey, who, amongst many other things, is a family care activist and novelist who is perhaps best known for having started the first domestic violence shelter in the modern world. Chiswick Women's Aid eventually grew into the organisation that is known today as Refuge, which is the largest domestic violence charity in the UK, runs the National Domestic Violence Helpline for England and Wales, is estimated to have an annual income of over £10 million, funded mostly by the taxpayer, and to have quite disgracefully erased any mention of its founder from their official history. Happily, however, I suspect that most regular subscribers of the Glass Blind Spot will be entirely aware of Erin's rightful place in history, not just as a mother of the women's refuge movement, but more broadly as someone who over the past 50 years has done more than any other individual to raise awareness about the damage and generational impact inflicted on families who have experienced violence in their home. Erin's advocacy work personally helped me to trust my own instinct that there is something profoundly disingenuous and dangerous about the popular narrative around so-called gendered violence. And indeed, it was her testimony and her story that played a pivotal role in helping me to be able to personally push past what can best be described as the excessive amount of gaslighting and public policy gatekeeping that occurs around the subject of interpersonal violence. In other words, there would be no Glass Blind Spots without Erin Pizzey, so it was an absolute honour to speak to her. During an extended discussion, we cover a range of subjects including parental alienation and the impact that domestic violence can have on young children, how the feminist movement hijacked the work that Erin started and have come to dominate a sector that receives millions of pounds of public money every year. We discuss the lack of scrutiny and public accounting around how that money is spent, how the widespread direct sex discrimination practices promoted within the sector adversely impact on boys and men, and also some of the women most in need of specialist help. We consider the little known fact that the first ever person ever employed in a women's refuge was actually a man, the power and privilege of parenting, the Istanbul Convention, and happily the new generation of women leading the call for change. Unfortunately, due to technical problems, our discussion is audio only, and before we jump straight into it, I'm going to play a quick clip of two comedians who are well past their sell-by date, one of whom makes a claim that I have for a very long time been keen to discuss with Erin Pizzey.
And it often happens when you talk about women's aid, people are like, oh, well, where's men's aid? I'm like that. I'll tell you what, get a squat, put a mattress on the floor, have jumble cells for the entirety of the 80s, which was how we funded the women's movement, and then maybe we'll take you seriously. Set up your own refuge. Get on with it, mate.
Yeah.
Don't just be moaning at me because I did something good. And you wouldn't ring up. What I always say to people is, oh, well, it's not fair that a man can't stay in this refuge. It's like ringing up the Cats Protection League and saying, I've got this dog. Well, I suggest you open a dog shelter. Go and sort yourselves out.
Yeah.
You've got shitloads of capital. Use it. Not you, sorry, I'm not shouting at you.
No, it's okay. I feel partly culpable for having a penis.
Well, I watched the interview with Jess Phillips on YouTube, and as usual, she's a better stand-up comic than she is a member of Parliament. The woman is actually, the thing that is so outrageous is it doesn't even know her facts. So when she's busy saying that in the 80s they were doing jumble sales, that's rubbish. 1974 was the date when all of us lost the control over the narrative on domestic violence.
Yeah.
So in 1971, when I opened the first refuge in the world by accident, and I must tell you, I'm no saint, because if I'd known what was going to come to a little community centre for mothers and children in Chiswick, I would have run away.
Okay.
Because what happened is that first woman, Kathy, when she came in, we were just an ordinary little community centre. We all had keys to the house, bring our kids, share clothes and toys, and women coming in from around us saying, my old man's in prison, can you help me? And suddenly she took off her jersey and she was blue from her neck down to her waist, because Wally, her husband, had taken a chair leg to her and beaten her badly.
Yeah.
And what she said, standing in front of me, was, and no one will help me. As a child, when I was 17, my twin sister, my brother was 14, my very violent father actually refused to bury my mother. She was brought home, she died of cancer. She was brought home, put in the dining room, and he locked us into that house with everybody in the village of Axminster knew what was going on, and nobody would help us. And it was hot, and he made us look every night at her body. Anyway, I'm saying this not as a shocking revelation, but as for you to understand why, the moment Kathy said that, something inside me said, I cannot let this go on.
Yeah.
So I took her home that night. And virtually overnight, it was like an accident happened, and the message went out, there is somewhere to run to.
Yeah.
And women just poured. We had 4 little rooms, an outside lavatory, and a kitchen. And in there, we got up to something like 56 mothers and children. So that the children would sleep on the mattresses on the floor that we got from the Salvation Army. And the women would sleep against the wall with their heads on their knees.
Yeah.
We got food from Marks and Spencer's at the end of the night. We got food from the vegetable shop, the butchers, and the fishmongers, because there was no money involved. Because the moment I started to try and look into welfare for these women, the social workers would pop up and say, well, you can't get welfare. Her husband wants her back. So what had happened before, as you probably know, I don't know if you do know this, if a woman was on the run and it was bad enough, the only thing a social worker could do legally was to put her in the local homeless family unit, where she'd be found almost immediately in his own area.
Okay.
And then what happened after that is the social worker would say, well, look, he's so violent, I'm going to take your children into care and you go and find yourself accommodation. So she knew then her children would be gone. She'd never, ever. So that's what used to happen. That's why women didn't leave. But it's not as simple as that. Because when the women started pouring in, I knew some of the women coming in were as violent as the men they left.
Yeah.
So I knew from the very beginning it was not a gender issue. And I did a study as we moved on and more women came in, on the first 100 women that actually came into the refuge with their children. And of those 100, 62 were as violent as their partners, in some cases more violent.
And I'm sure, just sorry to interrupt, I'm sure you're familiar with I think it's the PASC project.
Yes, I'm very familiar with it. It said that all along.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that sort of struck me. I've heard you say that before, that roughly 60% of the women were violent, and that's exactly the same. So, roughly, I think it was maybe 58% or whatever, that's a worldwide survey found.
But I don't want people to try. See, this is not a numbers game.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Like this. And Jess Phillips is one of the stupid women, or cunning women, who know that this is a cash cow for women.
Yeah.
So if we go back to the very early days, the beginning of the whole concept of women's liberation, which it was in '69, it began as a business deal. It began with women in Washington, a small group of very powerful women who were left-wing, mostly international Marxists with their partners, turning on their partners and saying, we want a women's movement of our own. We're tired of servicing men in their male capitalist movement. We are now going to move the goalposts, and it is patriarchy that's the enemy, i.e. all men. So out of this comes the mantra, all women are innocent victims of men's violence. And that now, next year is the 50th year that I opened the refuge.
Yeah.
And that 50 years has been used against men and boys and the family, and it was planned. From the very beginning, in the great big meetings that they used to have in London, and actually in Ireland, the mantra was, marriage is a dangerous place for women and children. The new unit is going to be women and children without men. Yeah. And it has been remarkably effective.
And that, again, isn't that officially the definition of a family now? During the Labour Party's kind of last run, if I remember correctly, they removed father as necessarily being part of the family units.
I don't know about that, but I do know that in 1990, Harriet Harman and various others of her group wrote a paper. It was a policy paper for the Labour Party, and in it she says, men are not necessarily harmonious to family life.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, that is a guarded way of saying men out.
Yeah.
But to go back to Jess Phillips, which is why I call her, a stand-up artist and a liar, because she's claiming facts that are actually not true.
Yes.
By the 1980s, the Women's Aid was very heavily, and also Refuge, was very heavily subsidized. Now it's around, I think it's around 300 million altogether that goes to both organizations. And Sandra Hawley, who took over from my refuge, I lost my refuge, she gets paid £220,000 a year.
Yeah. That's
more than the Prime Minister.
Yeah, and it's also roughly about half of what comes out of the budget from the violence against women and girls Home Office budget.
But the tragedy of all this is that, and why it breaks my heart, is because the women who most need refuges are the women like myself and all of us who came from generational violence and dysfunction. Because once those women started coming in, they were the ones that you most had to take care of to help them actually relearn their behavior patterns. Because they're born into violence, they only ever experience violence, and no one ever says to them, hang on a minute, if you look what created you, and you could go, we used to sit down and go back several generations, you could see that they were traumatized from the moment they were born, and probably in the womb, because I used to say to the mothers, if you smoke, you share it with the baby. If you drink, you share it with the baby. And the chemicals of rage and fear, you share with your baby. So if you go back and also explain the damage it does to their children, and then slowly be able to help them change their patterns, because violent people go directly from frustration and pain to rage.
Yeah.
Because when you're a child in a violent family, you're too frightened to show any kind of fear. What you tend to do is basically to bottle it all up. And then if you're a boy, you're more likely to explode. And women more likely to implode and damage themselves. So if you look at our experience, I was an extremely violent child. I wrote a memoir about my childhood to try and explain to people what it means. And I called it Infernal Child.
Okay.
And it was interesting that the amount of people who wrote in and said that's exactly what it was like for me. And believe me, it was nothing like as bad as an awful lot of other people. Because at least my father was in the Foreign Office. We were in big houses with lots of servants around. So you had people that you could go and get help from. The majority of families don't have that.
Yeah.
And it was interesting, actually, because as far as I was concerned, so in 1974, Chiswick called a little tiny meeting of other groups that were just then setting up. And they came into our little church hall, and then we saw them. They had already organized themselves long before they got to us. They voted themselves into the Women's Aid Federation, and we looked at them and we thought, this is nothing that we want to have anything to do with. Because again, we heard the same old rhetoric. You know, men were dangerous, women had to leave men, and so we just got up and walked out and left them to it. They became Women's Aid Federation. This is 1974, and from then onwards they got money.
Yeah. And
once I was ousted from the refuge, and Sandra Hawley came in, and that would have been 1982, 81, 82.
Okay.
They were well funded, very well funded. So
yeah,
she's just lying.
Yeah, I mean, well, apart from anything else, Jess Phillips was born in 1981, and the year after, somebody came and literally took your project, which had been, developed over many years, and as you say, by that stage, a lot of public funding. Just looking into this area, and I do think there are, you probably understand this more than most, there are a lot of kind of psychological barriers to even beginning to, for the layperson to start thinking about kind of, what actually lies behind an advert for, kind of a service that's for women. And, kind of in my experience, the bombshell moment for me, because obviously, to start off with, am I just a women hater, or am I going to be accused of being a women hater? Have I got some suspicion about this? But I had a feeling, and the bombshell for me is what you're saying about the generational violence, because that's extremely logical, and it's, I would say, kind of pretty well understood in other areas.
But this is the thing, it's understood in the academic world now more than ever, because all the research because it's a young movement when you think. It's only 50 years old. So now what's happening is there are a huge amount of young, very ambitious women working in universities. They're getting their PhDs and degrees, and what they're looking at is the actual evidence-based research. And what they find, and they will find, and hopefully next year, we'll have a conference to discuss this, it never was a gender issue. That was a political movement. That it's a human issue. It's a generational violence issue. And therefore, it's both men and women are affected and infected. And one of the things that I always found so interesting, and this I hope will eventually be shown, is that women, little girls coming into the refuge, were able, as women are, very quickly to settle in, make their friendship circles with other little girls. It was the boys who were so badly traumatized. And the hardest part for a boy is if the mother is violent, and violent towards the children. Because for him, and particularly for boys, they simply aren't able to talk to each other about human issues. And that's been one of the biggest problems we have. For men, because men feel weak and impotent, if they can't defend themselves, they don't want to confess up. And they're quite right in many ways, because other men are the ones who tease them. Other men are the ones who call them women's blouses. Why can't you be a man? All the rest of it. And this has been a problem all the way through. But to go back to the whole subject, so once the 1974, the narrative was taken over, me and my mothers went back to the refuge and we discussed it, and we just all said, look, we're not going to spend our time getting involved with women's conferences, which is how Women's Aid behave, and politicize the subject. It's nothing to do with politics, because we knew perfectly well that many of the men who were very brutal, we knew their back histories from the women coming in, which is why I immediately tried to open a men's house. And the GLC, at that point, the Greater London Council, did give me a lovely house up in the north of England. But my problem was that when we moved men in, men would not respond with each other like the women did. That's why it was such a cheap project in Chiswick, because the mothers did all the running, they did all the taking care of, they did all the catering and the cleaning. The men simply disappeared off into separate rooms and didn't connect with each other. But that wasn't the only problem. The biggest problem I had is the male millionaires who were willing to help me with mothers and children, more than willing, wouldn't give me a penny for men. That has been a massive problem that men really need to look at.
Yeah, and that's we call that the empathy gap, really. Kind of that there is, and you see that with charities. People will give money to charities for women and children, but if men are added to that list,
I'm a patron for Family Needs Fathers, which does a brilliant job, and Mankind.
Yeah,
and they get derisory amounts of money.
Yeah,
and basically, I'm also very, very much involved with parental alienation, which is again, it's not gendered, but it's a really serious problem for it. But any kind of separation where one or both or one parent decides to vitriolically make sure to ban the other party, they get no support at all. In fact, on the whole, people like CAFCAS and other organisations try to pretend it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So
go ahead.
We ignore the most serious problem that we have across the Western world, which is the planned destruction of the family and the ousting of fathers, the role of fathers and also of boys.
Yeah. And you see that again in terms of the evidence of the impact of fatherlessness in terms of, so many life outcomes. It is kind of crazy that there's such a kind of political roadblock about even talking about these things. Yeah. I want to ask you.
The roadblock is we want to, well, I don't, but too many men, and it is mostly men, women know each other very well.
Yeah.
It's men who want their women on a pedestal.
Yeah.
Women can't, oh no, I can't believe she'd do that. No, there's no such thing as women pedophiles. Yes, there are.
Yeah.
I deal with them. And so on and so forth.
Well, let me ask you a question, because kind of that point you're making about why the men's house didn't work. I can see kind of the likes of Jess Phillips particularly grabbing at that and going, well, men can't sort it out for themselves. So what I suppose my question would be, in terms of this kind of concept of gendered approaches to helping vulnerable victims of domestic violence, how credible is that, do you think? Obviously you're pointing to that men react differently, so perhaps different approaches will work more effectively. But do you think it's necessary that only men work with men and only women work with women, for example? From the very beginning, the mothers actually, we used to have these meetings at 10 o'clock in the big sitting room. Mums would come in, we'd all get together and discuss everything that was happening during the day or the night before. And one of the first things we all talked about was having a man to come to look after the children. Because we all knew, and many of the mothers said that their children had never known a kind, gentle man. Yeah.
The places that they'd come from, violence was cultural in those areas. You go down to some of the states in Brixton, and it's epidemic there.
Yeah.
And so, what chance have children to grow up without being aware of violence and violence in their own families? Yes, I do actually genuinely believe that it. And the last time I went to a men's project, it was Denmark.
Yeah.
And there was a really good project, and they were lucky enough they had enough money to buy their own house.
Okay.
And men and women were working in there. They had 10 men and their families, children. Okay. So that was brilliant, and it worked. But you do it in a way, because for men, it is for a woman to see herself as a victim. She knows that she will be pitied and supported and taken care of. For a man to even think that he might be a victim, he knows he'll get none of that.
Yeah. And is it fair to say men are less likely to kind of recognize that they're actually a victim as such?
Absolutely. Oh, it's her temper. No, just a temper tantrum.
Sure.
And then you talked about, he's dead now, bless his heart, and it wasn't his wife that killed him. He died of an illness. But he woke up one day having always denied that she was violent and found his bed alight.
Jeez.
That's finally when they actually decide to do something. Usually when it gets so serious that they have to leave.
Yeah, no, it's frightening. I was going to ask, Another kind of groundbreaking moment for me. I've a kind of pretty solid understanding of the equality laws in the UK, and it always surprised me that the domestic violence sector, so to speak, and organisations like Women's Aid, for example, quite often identify as kind of women-only organisations or a women-only sector, and kind of they quite literally won't have a man about the place. And kind of obviously that's been illegal since the 1970s because of the Sex Discrimination Act.
It still goes on.
Yeah, but it kind of goes.
They get away with it. They get away with it completely. But
Yeah.
even though, as a model, as the first model in the world, there were half men working in the refuge, and their contribution was vital.
Yeah.
Because not only were they wonderful with the children, but they're also the mothers. I mean, the mothers kept saying, well, Mike Dunn, who particularly interesting, he was Irish, and he played rugger. He was a great big guy.
Okay.
And he was a priest for 3 weeks, and he gave it up. And I found him, actually, and he came to work with me, and he was probably the linchpin, along with a woman called Anna Ashby. And Mike, the women used to say, Mike's not a man. And they'd say, well, why isn't he a man? I'd say, well, he doesn't hit anybody. He doesn't get angry.
Okay, yeah.
It took them ages to break that idea that is what is a man.
Yeah. And that struck me, and particularly, for children. And the thing is, I know that the sector, they rely on a very narrow exemption, which, kind of essentially it allows that, for example, you might need a women member of staff to go into women's changing rooms or, for reasons of privacy and decency. But, it's a very, very narrow kind of law. But they basically built an entire industry around that, and I was fascinated.
But that's all part of the ring fencing for money.
Ring fencing, oh, absolutely.
Because not only do they then fund the refuge movement, but then all the universities. How about all the gender studies?
Yeah.
Men couldn't go into those studies.
Yeah.
So they
yeah.
And it really began because a huge amount of American women couldn't get whatever it is when they want to become professors, couldn't get tenure. And suddenly they created tenure for all women. Any woman who wants to get into university, she simply goes on, and then she goes into the gendered studies, and she's fit for life.
Yeah.
So in a way, you have to think of it politically, because they're not interested. You see, this is the thing: Women's Aid and the Federation and Refuge aren't interested in women's issues. If they were, they would be talking about violent women who need care and whose only hope. Because my great sorrow is that we had a long-term project for our violence-prone mothers. They came in, they learned actually how to react to violence and frustration calmly and peacefully. Then they were ready, and they shared, and they moved on into we had other houses, and they moved in with their friends. So they weren't just put out into the cold world as a single-parent mother, which they were too vulnerable at that point. They then stayed in the second stage houses until they got rehoused themselves. So that was about 3 years.
Yeah.
And we had houses all over England. And it was a therapeutic program, and it was all smashed and destroyed.
That's the tragedy of it, to look back and realize that, there was such significant work established and, kind of heading in a direction, and then for it just to be, kind of consumed by politics.
Well, consumed by the women's movement, because at the time they came to hijack it, they had no money. The women's movement, it began, if you think, when it began in '69, we were all told that we paid £3.10, which to a housewife is actually a lot of money in those days.
Sure.
£3.10 to join. And I don't know if you remember the history, but then we were all told we were to go back to our houses, and we were to collect our friends, and we were to have these meetings, and we were to raise our consciousness. Now, what they didn't realize about me is that my parents, when in 1949, I was 11, they were captured by the communists. My father had been posted to Tin Sin, and they were under house arrest under communists for 3 years. We didn't know whether they were dead or alive.
Yeah.
So those words had a huge resonance for me.
Yeah.
Because we were then told we could call each other comrade. And then there was thereafter the head office, which was in Shaftesbury Avenue or off Shaftesbury Avenue, that would send people down to instruct us and say things like, your problem isn't the fact, like I said, what is your problem? My problem is I'm alone with 2 small children because my husband's away and I'm very lonely and I want to find somewhere where I can meet other women, not in our kitchens, but somewhere where we can go and work together in our communities. No, that's not your problem. It's your husband. He oppresses you.
Yeah. Yeah. When I say politics, I mean essentially the women's movement, the feminist movement, and you have.
But the women's politics had nothing to do with women, were they? They were all to do with the women's concept of men. All men are abusive of women.
Yeah, yeah, and that's it. I mean, and even I suppose, even from my perspective, when I started looking at this, it wasn't the men that were being cut loose that most shocked me. It was the way that, well, as you say, violent women aren't getting the help that they need.
Absolutely.
So that's a factor. But the children are not being served well by this. And to learn that apparently still in England, once you're 12, if you're a boy,
it's probably in Ireland as well. It's across the Western world. Sometimes it's 9, but usually it's 12. You can't go into the refuges.
Okay.
So we had dormitory accommodation. So we had 16, 18-year-old men, really, coming into the refuge with their mothers. It didn't cross our minds that they should be barred. But what we did is we raised the money and we bought a boys' house down the back of Chiswick in Oxford Road North, I think it was. And we had a house for boys. So when they got to 15, if they wanted to move into the boys' house, they were welcome. And there was a project there. And the thing about the project that was so valuable was that we then found there was a whole group of men who were out of work, and they formed themselves into a group called We People. And they were mostly plumbers, plasterers, builders, everything. We used to apprentice each boy to one man, and they'd work together. And it was very carefully thought out. So the boys, if they didn't want to work, absolutely fine. Everybody else got paid by the hour. So every day, at the end of the day, they got money in their pockets. If they didn't want to work, fine. But the other boys could go off to the pub, and he soon learned that it's worth putting some time in. And then beginning to make a relationship with a good man. That was destroyed. They closed my boys' house down. And the other more important one was, well, it had a residence family living there. It was the home for indefinite stay. This is for mothers who would never be able to have children, to keep their children on their own. But if they were in for indefinite stay, they could. And this is how we should have gone on.
Yes.
You know what happens now? Now what happens? If a woman is perceived to be with a violent man, immediately she will lose her children or take them into care. So if a woman is with a violent man, she tries to get help.
Okay.
They'll say, fine, you have to get rid of him. Just overnight, he's got to go. If she is seen or suspected of continuing a relationship with him, they simply take her children away. And then what does she do? She replaces them. So we repeat the problem. Judges will tell you they sit there year after year after year, having social workers coming up. Poor social workers, I'm not criticizing them. What else can they do? Because there is no mechanism to take care of women who are violent. There's no residential programs.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing amazes me. I want to sort of propose a theory about the violence against women and girls strategy. I suspect you'll agree with me. Just pulling it back to the thing I was saying about the equality legislation and this kind of exception that you can, say this job must only be for a woman. Now, hearing the interview where you talked about the first person ever employed by Refuge being a man, and actually probably meeting the criteria for that exception because you specifically wanted a man to act as a role model, I kind of thought that sort of blew that out of the water a little bit. The other thing that blew it out of the water for me was the lady who took your refuge, Sandra Horley.
Yeah.
Her husband certainly used to be the professional photographer for Refuge, and was, kind of basically, was touring up and down the country, going to refuges and taking, kind of official pictures.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, that came out in the press, and I think Deborah Powney pointed that towards me. But my point is, so clearly Sandra Horley doesn't actually believe in women-only spaces either, when it comes down to it. And in Northern Ireland, we got kind of legislation a little bit quicker than in England, and that was it's essentially called the equality duty in the UK or in England and Wales, and it's about public services, and it's about looking at ensuring that public money is being spent in and services are provided to everybody equally, and there's no discrimination. And my theory is essentially the violence against women and girls kind of strategy seemed to kind of start to coalesce around that time, because again, it's about ring fencing, and it was about somehow circumventing the need to. Right. Do you think that's credible?
It was an immediate political move. Yes.
Yeah.
It was. Yeah, and it always will be until somebody holds the whole refuge movement, including the Federation, to account, and they have never been held to account.
Yeah,
and that's never been told. They have to account publicly for how they spend the 300 million a year, and where it goes and what it goes on. Because you have to remember that each refuge, the rent that the mothers pay, which is paid by the taxpayer, is also, it's factored in as enough money to cover staff. So if the refuges are largely self-supporting, where's the money going?
Yeah. Well, that again was a shocking revelation to me. Deborah Powney pointed this to me. But am I correct in thinking that if a woman is staying in a women's refuge, then she must pay for her boards?
No, only if she's not supported by welfare. In other words, she's basically. Now, immigrant women, it's a different business, because if all an immigrant woman has to do now, and this is very dangerous, is to say, again, we have to start with a discussion about the fact that there is no evidence needed when you make an allegation of domestic violence.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the beginning when I was first running the refuge. What happened then, in order for a divorce to happen, in court, there had to be pictorial evidence. That's evidence of bruising, broken bones, doctor's evidence, and the rest of it, before you could lay an allegation. And interestingly enough, this is a bit of history that's important, because one of the things that I think made a difference, when I started talking about domestic violence in what's called a posh voice, that was the first time, because it always assumed it was the sort of people who kept coal in the bath that hit women. The idea that it was actually right the way across, up to the royal family and aristocrats, didn't exist. Okay, so I said at the time, because the Shand kid, Johnny Spencer, Princess Di's mother and father.
Okay.
Now, she had all the evidence she needed. She had the bruises and the bones and all the rest of it. And she was trying to divorce Princess Diana's father, Johnny Spencer. And what happened over that was happening just as I opened up, or just before. And what happened was that she put all her case into court. And you have to remember, he was equerry to the Queen, Johnny Spencer.
Okay. And
she was told, rather than have this huge, which it would be, an enormous scandal that would touch the royal family, if she took her case out of the court, that she would get the custody and the divorce. She was promised that. The next day, 24 hours later, he went into court and sued on grounds of adultery, and she lost custody of the children. And that's why Princess Diana and her brother would weep and cry, because they couldn't see their mum.
Wow.
So it goes right across. Now, I've been trying to get the papers of that divorce, because mostly divorces are public.
Okay.
You can't. It's with a judge. You have to go to a judge and it's under lock and key. And I want to see those papers. Anyway, that's the beginning of all this business of what was happening and hiding everything. And then from then onwards, the law changed, and you don't have to have any evidence. So any woman, this is why men aren't getting married or allowing women to move in with them.
Yeah.
All that has to happen is she picks up the phone and she says, I am frightened of him. He is shouting at me. He won't give me the money I want. He's automatically a domestic violence abuser. And he will be taken away.
Yeah. And that the bill that's kind of progressing through Parliament at the minute has a few sections in it which are quite troubling in relation to that in terms of the evidence required.
Yes, but then you know perfectly well that when we were all told this was going to happen, they were going to look into the family courts. We looked at the list of people who were chosen, Women's Aid, all women's organisations. There was nobody. I tried, but other people that I know of tried to get on that commission. We were ignored.
And why do you think you were ignored? I mean, you're quite a...
Anyway, because the idea that I will stand up and say that this is a fraudulent movement, to me it's an evil empire. It has destroyed the relationship between men and women. It has damaged marriage. And marriage is the foundation, actually, of all civilizations. You destroy that and you destroy the fabric of society. And that's what's happened.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It, I understand all of this, and most of the history. I've listened to many interviews with you, but again, even just talking to you, it is so shocking. One of the things I just struggle with so much is I can imagine the likes of Sandra Hawley or whomever's getting kind of £250,000 a year. I can see what her motivation might be. But in terms of people on the ground who kind of work in these services, because it's a big employment area.
Yeah, a lot of them work in those refuges, and they know it's wrong, but they feel very much like I felt when I was in other countries helping to set up refuges. I could see that the majority of people getting involved were feminists looking for money.
Yeah.
Okay, even that. At that point, I accepted, because any refuge is better than none. And it was so fragile keeping the refuges open. It is now, because one of the problems is that the outcomes of not being accountable is that there's no ongoing history of how the refuges are successful in helping women to move on into normal, loving, warm relationships and their children. There's nothing.
Yeah. And
if you do that, if you absolutely ignore your accountability, so that you have no dialogue with the people. When I'm saying the people, I mean people on the street who are paying. This is taxpayers' money. You have no, because you have no respect for the people who are funding you. Then what do you think is going to happen?
Interestingly, the chap in that video that I sent you, who was interviewing Jess Phillips, he has raised, I think it's about £500,000 for refuge. And I'd be very surprised if he's looked into exactly where his money's going. I struggle to kind of understand why, particularly how people working in that industry don't question the narrative.
Well, they won't have a job.
And that, I guess that
is the truth, yeah.
And then obviously politicians, to some extent, don't question the narrative because they mightn't be in a job either.
That's the thing, and it's interesting because I went to see Philip Davis. He's a really good man.
Yeah.
He's the only MP he's the one who actually stood up and said we have to have a men's day. And was ridiculed, including by Jess Phillips, who I think she was the one who said yes, but every day's Men's Day.
Yeah, that's right.
But as he said, after he's spoken in the House, which is usually empty, except for people who want to barrack him, which is not Jess Phillips, he said men come up to him and say, I really respect you. He says, but, he's a pariah.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Women's Equality Party stood against him. Mm-hmm. And certainly there seemed to be some sort of inference that some of the things they were saying about him on the doorstep were extremely unpleasant, and yet he got voted back in with a higher majority. So
He always will, because he's a very good MP.
yeah, yeah,
And really more of them. The problem is, the climate now is so against men that if a man is trying to debate with a woman, he's immediately misogynist.
yeah.
And that has become. I just feel that in 50 years' time, when we look back at the history of this movement, we're going to call it the dark ages of human relationships. I have asked many historians if, in their expert opinion, there's ever been a time where women have turned on their menfolk the way they have this century, or last century and this century, and they can't recount a time. It is inexplicable.
Yes, I guess. I suppose the question is why. I mean, it's $1 million question.
If according to my experience, and that's all I can tell you.
Yeah.
When Betty Friedan was busy writing Feminine Mystique, which is really the first book that talked about the women dissatisfaction, not with men at that point, it was life in general.
Yeah.
And why did that dissatisfaction come? If you think back, my age group of women, remember our grandmothers who had no washing machines, no hoovers, housework was 24/7. It really was.
Yeah.
Suddenly, it was men who invented all these gadgets that actually freed women from all of that.
Yeah.
And women had time on their hands. What did they do with the time?
And the pill.
Well, that came much later, if you think.
Sorry, okay.
Really
Yeah, okay.
About 60. And then, I'll wait till I get there. So what happened was women's attitude, and which is the extraordinary thing, and I know that I was told that the idea to say, like I said, I consider myself privileged to be able to stay home and be with my children. And you got screamed at. Because the only advantage that women could see was that they would reach out for male power.
Yeah.
Thereby, once they had male power, which also created a form of woman who was no longer feminine, she was, whether you call her a ladette or whatever, she was out there doing all the things that men did as she saw it. They never understood the difference between being a house slave or a wage slave.
Yeah.
To me, a house slave is anything better than a wage slave. At least you're free. Your time is your own. But it's been a hard lesson for women because they've now lost the choice. Women have to go out to work, not just economically, but if you're a single parent mother, and this is the bit I absolutely hate, when your youngest child gets to a certain age, you're supposed to go and look for work. Who is going to be home for the children? Nobody.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, from a very early age, I, grasped the concept of equality of opportunity and choice. And obviously,
that's absolutely sacred for, absolutely.
And that obviously, what you're describing, which is the norm now, and now kind of, I mean, it's interesting looking back even at sort of back to the 1970s, and if you look at sort of, a mortgage and how much it kind of, a household could run with one income. Mm. And certainly for families, it would be very difficult to run with one income now. So it's, as you say, kind of they have to be wage slaves, whether really they want to. And
many don't. The trouble with being a wage slave is you still go back to all the housework that you haven't done while you're busy cleaning rooms for some other woman or standing behind a counter serving other women. So the trouble is, so much of this has been part of the movement. It was hugely popular among women journalists and the media particularly, because suddenly this was a whole new ring-fenced. Only women went to interview me in the refuge. I never had a man come on refuge. Yeah. This all belonged to women, so they could put their spin on absolutely everything.
Yeah.
And this is what they did. And of course, they're privileged journalists. The four of them at one point got together and all wrote articles about how they were going to go out and get pregnant by unknown men and then have babies that would not have fathers. And they did. And they wrote about it as though that was a really wonderful thing to do.
Wow.
That's how that sort of, and I remember the names of the women, but I'm not going to put them in for your sake.
Okay. Okay. Um, yeah. I mean, I'm interested, kind of by what you're saying about, historical periods and, kind of the sex war now, essentially. Um, Kind of one perspective I kind of cling on to, and I do get that sort of, kind of a lot of many women, will kind of, openly slag off men. And I think to some extent, kind of that's what partners do, and that's what sexes do. And some of it's in jest or venting steam.
Yeah.
I kind of am still vaguely optimistic that, I mean, you talk about there's a class of journalists, there's a professional set of professional feminists, there are a small proportion of women that kind of really buy into that feminist ideology. I'm kind of optimistic that most women, certainly listening to this, would be as shocked as I am about.
I think that's true. Yeah, because it never really reached women in the streets.
Yeah.
It was never, if feminism really was a caring movement, why aren't they not up in arms about the amount of children that are taken away from mothers? Because why aren't they fighting for more refuge space to put mothers and children in so that they can be in a therapeutic environment? They're not interested. They're not interested in women. They're interested in immigrant women because that's another source of income. This is now what happens. So immigrant woman arrives, and she is told, as soon as anybody can get to her by the women's movement, particularly women movement lawyers, of which there are plenty, that if she claims that she's a victim of domestic violence, she will immediately get right to remain, she will get access to welfare, and she will have a refuge bed for herself and her children. And he will probably be deported.
Yeah. Yeah. And that kind of echoes the situation in the family courts in terms of if a woman says she's been abused by her husband, all sorts of funding opens up.
Yes, and now it's interesting because there are two ways this goes. The fastest thing the feminist lawyer will tell you is to say domestic violence. You'll get your divorce through very quickly. And the best way is to pop into a refuge long enough so that when your case comes up, you're in a refuge. But the other thing, which is far more dangerous, and in Canada they call this the silver bullet. If it's not going fast enough, you're not getting what you want, say he's molested your children.
Yeah.
And then he's gone, he'll never see his children again.
Yeah. And, and so much of that kind of just makes obvious sense in terms of kind of logically, some people will be sick enough to do that, or prepared to do that. And you can,
Well, if you're put in a position where you're told that you know your marriage has failed, it may not have been very violent, but it failed, and you want to get out of it, and you want your children, and you come from a long line of violence-prone families, why wouldn't you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of you're pushing out an open door. I was just going to throw in an analogy, mainly just because it popped in my head. I don't know if you've ever heard this. This is probably about decades old now, but I remember hearing a story that in Tokyo, where they're kind of waiting for the big earthquake, and that's so they live under the shadow of that. They certainly used to have, I think, what they were called like the five wise men, something like that. These were kind of scientists in lab coats. No doubt now they'd probably have to be the five wise women, but kind of regardless. And the whole point about that was that sort of they were the clever scientists that understood all of this about earthquakes and would kind of warn the populace in time. And it was all a ruse, and it was just essentially something to give people comfort, kind of thing. But it's like the Wizard of Oz; they had no substance at all. That strikes me as people like Jess Phillips, who present themselves as experts in domestic violence, and kind of her career in women's aid was exclusively as a business development manager, which says something in itself.
It does,
doesn't it? But it strikes me that sort of absolutely the likes of politicians and perhaps public servants, etc., are nervous about touching this area or probing too deeply because they might be called a misogynist, or they might get fired, or it's quite an emotive subject. But do you think it's fair that sort of groups like Women's Aid are seen as, well, they're the experts.
Yeah.
They're the ones that have, so, kind of, we must listen to them.
That's absolutely right. And that's what they do all the training. So,
Yeah.
And so therefore, whether it's the police force or the judiciary, they all had to go through this very, very lucrative women's packages of training.
Yeah.
And it's heavily biased. And the social work degrees, you read the social work books that you have to know, they are heavily anti-male. And again, the old lie. And this is why, but like you, I see lovely green shoots coming up. And we can now talk about the fact that people like Deborah Powney, who is doing her research, her PhD, and she's nearly finished, and it will be published.
Yeah.
And for the first time, we have not just Deborah, but various other young women looking at the evidence and are equally as horrified as we are when they learn the truth. And there's a professor, Nicola, must get this right, Graham Cavan, who has always been in the forefront of this. She's from Leicester University. She's internationally well known, speaking about this gross, in a sense. I hesitate because I still feel this absolute sense of shock that women have been able to get away with actually making other women or painting other women as weak, helpless victims. It is so condescending for a feminist movement to take away our agency, to be fully grown, fully mature adult women, equal to be able to work alongside and with men, and to be able to take care of ourselves.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, when all this information comes out, I'm praying that it is going to be this conference that Deborah is organizing next year. Then we will begin what we need to do is to basically take the money away from the feminist movement, from Refuge, and from the National Federation of Women's Aid. The refuges will stay as they are. They will be open to men working equally.
Yeah.
We will care as much for men who come from violent backgrounds as we do for women, but particularly the children.
Yeah.
And that is my huge hope, because at the moment there is no future. There are some women who are very grateful. There are some really good refuges, and I know of them. But unfortunately, there are a whole lot of just hostels. And what the problem is that when the violent women go into the hostels, they basically end up bullying the non-violent women, who then often go home. And that's another big problem. It's never discussed.
Yes, there was a murder at a refuge in Jess Phillips's constituency recently, which he didn't speak very much about, interestingly. Yes, speaking of Deborah Powney, because I mean, obviously, I have huge respect for Deborah, and obviously, I've mentioned that kind of, one of the areas I wanted to talk about was a question that she repeatedly puts to Refuge, and it is the killer question, and I think it's essentially the question I asked myself at the start of my journey, and it's amazing how much opens up when you start to kind of learn the answer to that. So, do you mind me asking, what do you think happens to someone who rings the 24-hour National Domestic Abuse Hotline that's funded by the Home Office?
We talk about women or men ringing.
Well, I deliberately.
Okay. Well, if a woman rings, she will, and it's deemed that she is a victim of domestic violence. Yeah. Hopefully, she will be put onto a refuge somewhere in England. It can't be near her, but somewhere. Yeah. Although an awful lot of women, according to Women's Aid, they turn away. They don't have room, which is shocking, because we never turned anyone away. We simply, I'll just finish with this.
Yeah.
As far as men are concerned, that is the thing that bothers me most, because when the money was given out, I think it's a couple of years ago now, for women, it was up for tender for a hotline for men as well. Okay. Women's Aid got the money, not mankind, who's the obvious one to get the money.
Yeah.
All families need fathers who try to keep families together, or any of the male initiatives, and also in Scotland and Wales. No, the money was given to Women's Aid.
Yeah.
All right, so what they did, and it became very obvious, and it's been a long time this has been going on, men are screened. And when they're screened, usually what happens, they find themselves given a phone number to ring. They ring the phone number, and they find that they've gone down as perpetrators.
Yeah. And is this the Respect?
This is the Respect. Yeah, this is under Tony Blair.
Yeah.
Because you have to remember, Cherry Blair is also very active in this field, and she's one of the patrons for Refuge.
Yes, and it's a Labour MP who actually wrote the guidance for the men's helpline. I understand. I've forgotten her name now. No, I'll put it in the show notes. So I mean, that's my understanding. Essentially, if you're a man, and this was particularly pertinent, during the lockdown crisis, because you had the likes of Priti Patel going on to morning to television and telling the public that kind of, if you are experiencing domestic abuse, you're not alone. Phone the domestic abuse helpline funded by the Home Office. It's for men and women. She explicitly said that. And the reality is that it's a 24-hour hotline. If you're a man, they basically won't help you. They'll just give you another telephone number.
But what's even more worrying, though, is that once you're deemed as a perpetrator, you then find yourself being told that you have to take to move to one of the anger management programs. Now, the major anger management program that you probably know of is the Duluth model.
Yeah.
Now, I would be very grateful if you would actually put a link to show what the Duluth model is.
I will do.
It's this big circle. And the tragic part of this is, mostly when any contested case goes to court, Kafkas, or even the judge, even if the man is found not guilty, well, because the judges don't have any idea what the Duluth model is, essentially, he has to go on this course. So the stick is he has to go on the course. The carrot is, if he completes the course, he can see his children. If he doesn't complete the course, he goes again and again. And during that time, he can only see the children in a contact center. Now, when he starts the course, even if he's been found not guilty, and this is their idea of a therapeutic model, he then has to still do the Duluth model. First thing, when you do the Duluth model, is you have to say you're guilty. Doesn't matter what the court says. Okay, once he said he's guilty, to try and see his children, then he goes along, and the first thing he has to do is to apologize for his male privileges. Yeah, so what does that tell you about the Duluth model? It's a gendered, feminist model forcing men to accept what has been done to them in the name of...
And it's absolute bunkum. It's absolute bunkum. And
it's proven to be completely false.
And admittedly so by the creator of it as well, which is one of the remarkable things. Yeah. And kind of branch it into intersectionality, which I always find sort of has feminism sort of turning on its heel somewhat. It was kind of viewed as slightly homophobic as well, because it only looked at heterosexual couples. And then
on the other hand, you wouldn't dare look at same-sex couples, because the worst of the violence is between women.
Yeah, repeatedly that's been found.
And I kept saying that in the 1970s, and nobody would listen.
Yeah,
it's extraordinary how you can be brushed completely out of history.
It is quite remarkable, and I guess ultimately, I personally, was quite nervous starting up my little project, and it's just a small little modest project, and the reality is, because kind of the feminist lobby is very powerful, and kind of they do go after anyone, and I know they went after you.
Well, they don't do it now because there's too much money involved, but in the old days they picketed everywhere I went, screaming and yelling, and it was really, really tough. But my feeling now is it's looking to the future. That is what we should be doing, and it isn't a question of, we have to undo so much of what has gone through as law.
Yeah.
I mean, the biggest and the worst, I think, is the idea that a man at any time can be convicted with no evidence at all. And this goes back to, I don't know if you saw the case that took place on Waterloo Station with a young man who was going home. He bought his ticket. Do you remember?
I do. Fortunately, he got found not guilty eventually.
Yes, but what good is that? Because the not guilty means that as far as she's concerned, she's protected for life. No one can ever use her name or tell anybody who it is.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely.
And she also gets money. People don't realise, if you as a woman make an allegation, a sexual allegation against a man, and almost immediately, before the case is even tried, you then can claim money. You claim it under the, you'd have to probably look it up. It's the Criminal Compensation Board. And it's good money. You can get up to £50,000 and you don't pay it back.
And that's clearly an incentive.
Yeah, well, clearly. Sure it is. It's a lot of money.
That case was remarkable. You know, I think that highlighted it. I was
involved in that case. That's why I know so much about it.
Yeah.
And it was absolutely obvious before the case even went to trial that she was lying. It was obvious from the evidence she gave that she was lying. What she suggested physically happened couldn't possibly physically happen.
That's interesting because, you know, kind of hearing that story, and I was absolutely shocked that the CPS progressed with it. Mm-hmm. But kind of, you know, in terms of that actual individual, my assumption was kind of, well, she must have just been mentally ill or mistaken. Yeah.
No, she wasn't mistaken.
So it could have been potentially literally kind of for money.
Yes, I think so. Wow. She was an actress. That's really why it got headlines, because it was a high profile case. Yes. She was a known actress.
Yes.
And but if you really want to find out her name, you can, because it's on American online.
Yeah, because she was in a very high profile television series as well.
Yes. Yeah, and a radio show.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Okay, let me just think. Track my train of thought. Oh yes, actually, I mean, you were saying about we need to get rid of, you know, kind of look at the legislation again. So what's your view of the Istanbul Convention?
Well, it's just more of the same.
Yeah.
And now somebody's actually who is it? Somebody in Europe, one of the countries of Europe, have actually bailed
Poland.
out.
Yeah, Poland has bailed out of it.
That's right, and I hope more will. When this all comes to light, it'll be rescinded. But not only that, you know, United Nations, all of it has to actually essentially be almost hygienically scoured to get rid of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that really, and take the money away, and use the money wisely and properly. It's quite simple, really, if you think about it. If you are born into a violent and dysfunctional household, you are damaged. Some people are very lucky, for one reason or another, they actually transcend the damage, usually because they found a good mentor when they're younger. But people that don't and continue the pattern, which is generational, what will happen eventually is, as really has happened now, we know many, many countries, Western countries, have a huge amount of very feral young men who are unemployable. And then you see what we're seeing happening now, the chaos, the anarchy, because that is what a violent family is. It's chaos and anarchy.
Yeah. And you're seeing that on the American streets at the minute.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
You know, it's not coincidentally, you know, kind of the black, the African American community has been described as the kind of the canary in the coal mine because of the levels of fatherlessness in that community.
And here. You know, and the rise of the gangs, they're very serious.
Yeah.
We don't ever talk about it.
And that's because you'll be accused of racism.
Absolutely.
Or sexism or both.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's interesting about I mean, in terms of green shoots, I'll mention what I hope is kind of some positive news from Northern Ireland. One thing I did for the project I'm working on is I wrote to Priti Patel, Home Office, Home Secretary, and asked her the question that I asked you: what happens to people when they phone the hotline or the helpline? Now in Northern Ireland we have a kind of separate helpline, and it did used to be run by Women's Aid, and I know, kind of looking at their annual reports, they were reporting that approximately it was open to men and women on the front door, which was significant enough in itself because as we've already discussed, it's not even open to men in the rest of the UK. But they did take calls, and it was specifically to do with the funding, which again says something about that principle. Kind of, they wouldn't have got the funding if they hadn't taken male calls, because the government wanted a national helpline, and obviously there are equality laws. So, you know, but yes, they were reporting, I think like 2 or 3% of calls were male, and they were essentially kind of, you know, making the point that, well, this is what we would expect in terms of the population of domestic violence victims, which obviously doesn't correlate. Yeah, it's absolute rubbish. And it certainly doesn't correlate even with the local police service statistics. And that, you know, one might argue is the sort of the peak of the iceberg. But so I wrote to Northern Ireland's Justice Minister asking the same question, and was assured that men and women are treated equally by that service and are provided the same service, and there are additional support services that men are referred to in a parallel way to the likes of refuge services. Now, understanding the infrastructure of how it's grown really from a grassroots level since the 1970s, and people like you, I wouldn't be so confident as to think that men are necessarily getting the same quality of service or the same availability.
Yeah, but you know, what you have to think of is, it's all very well, okay, he can ring up.
Yeah.
But where's he going to go with the children?
Yeah. And
why is it available for women to be able to leave and not men and the children?
Yeah. And Northern Ireland, just to sort of put the downside, is the only country in the UK that doesn't have at least one bed for men in refuge services. So absolutely, no, I agree. But kind of, I suppose, just, you know, kind of the green shoots that I'm kind of pointing to is the Justice Minister said in her letter that she was disappointed to learn that the English helpline is not, you know, available to men, which I thought was kind of interesting. I don't know what.
It's such an ambiguous word, because does she mean she's going to do something about it, or is that just her being politically sophisticated?
Well, I mean, you know, absolutely. You know,
when we actually have equal services, we stop thinking it is a numbers game. It's nothing to do with how many men, how many women. It's to do with the fact that most people, a larger majority, as I found, 62%, coming out of domestic violence in childhood will unfortunately repeat the pattern. That's what fills our prisons and our mental hospitals. We're willing to intervene in the very early years, and also to educate in schools, not just about sex, but about relationships.
Yeah.
If young school children can come to school counsellors for counselling when they're coming from violent families, then a huge amount would change.
Yeah.
But we've got to stop taking children away from mothers, because if you don't mother the mother, there's no chance of her mothering the children. And of course there are, because some women and men transcend, but the majority won't be able to. Mothering and fathering isn't like Nescafe. You just pour boiling water over it. It's learned, like everything else.
Yeah. And it needs a remarkable amount of support. And that used to be, in terms of extended families, etc., exactly. That used to be much more.
But once they destroyed, when I started in Belmont Terrace, that's the tiny refuge, behind us were houses that had related families for several hundred years. So you had, if your mum and dad were hitting each other. Actually, I lived in Italy, in a village in Italy, and in the 6 years I was there, it was so interesting because only one woman went into hospital from domestic violence because the families dealt with it. And the man knew, and the women knew, you lift your hands and you're going to answer to the whole of the family.
Yeah.
And that's always how it's been, but you can't do it now.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating, and I'm always fascinated to learn more about your story and your insight. I kind of perceive myself as somebody who's probably a little bit naive and probably a little bit too optimistic at the best of times. But kind of, I mean, do you think it's wrong that I'm optimistic, that I think things can change quite dramatically?
Things have changed. Now, come on. 1971, when I went to look for anything, any evidence, any research, any academic research on domestic violence between men and women, there was absolutely nothing. Nothing. Yeah. That's why I had to write Scream Quietly or The Neighbours Will Hear, which is the first book, which is, of course, out of print. And this is the problem, that the closing down on this subject. It has been hijacked, but it's coming good now. I always thought, don't waste your time fighting with these people. Ignore them. Just get on with your one-to-one relationships, helping people, men and women and children who have come from this kind of family background. Just get on with it, because eventually history and time will sort it, and it is doing that now. I have huge hope, great faith. I'm 81 now.
Yeah.
And hopefully, all I want to see before I die is that domestic violence, the roots of domestic violence, are found in generational family violence, and because that means it's treatable.
Yeah.
And it's the treatable that we now have to look to.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And it's the cycle of violence. You then get out the cycle of violence, and then you have the ambition to, for example, there's debates about whether a government strategy for male suicide should be, the goal should be no suicides. That's a goal. And in the same way, kind of the goal in this area should be a significant reduction in incidents, and not because people are afraid to go to the police, or or laws are kind of being extended in such ways that people are actually encouraged to fabricate incidents, which there certainly is an element of that, at least.
And you have to think the police force, the majority of the work the police force does now is to intervene in marital quarrels.
Yeah.
And they're called out time and time again. And she'll get to the door and she'll say, "Oh, it's all right. You don't have to worry."
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I mean, I've heard that described as kind of almost like a tactic in terms of kind of controlling nature.
And also, you have to be careful, because the same with the refuges. You have to be careful, because she'll come in with the children, and she's not actually genuinely. She's just that's part of her marital tactic, to go into a refuge and threaten him from there. That's why you have to work with men as well as women. Yes, many of the men will be violent, many of them will be brutal, but I'm dealing with the same small child that was sexually and hugely abused, and has grown up without understanding that there are other alternatives. You have to work with both.
Yeah. Well, listen, Erin, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom, and thank you, kind of for all your efforts over the years for both men and women. And I think you're a testament to the direction that this whole subject needs to be sort of traveling to. I think I've said sort of kind of your story. I kind of when I started to look at this, and it did interact with I had to make sort of judgments in terms of kind of the work I was doing. Instinctually, kind of the status quo, the order felt wrong in terms of what was happening, and it was learning about people like yourself and your story that helped to reinforce me that absolutely, of course, this is madness. Final question: what would you say to anyone listening who is kind of thinking, well, I want to be part of the solution in terms of solving this? What would your advice be to them?
I would say join Families Need Fathers and help them, and become and create the group, another group, or certainly Mankind, because they are very, very good people, and they've both got websites. And just join and become part of the solution. Okay.
And I will leave links for those also.
Please do. And also, could you leave a link for my website?
Yes, I will. I didn't.
www.honest-ribbon.org.
Ribbon. And is that, if I'm right in thinking, is that in reaction to the White Ribbon campaign?
They sued me because originally I had the domain name whiteribbon.org,
Oh, right.
And so, that was the beginning of my website.
Okay.
And they sued me, but they said because that would cause confusion. And then, of course, they were found to be completely, essentially the majority of the money that went to White Ribbon Australia was actually spent on conferences and airfares and didn't get to refugees. But they still sued me and I lost. So I had to change the name. That's why I called it Honest Ribbon.
Wow.
Yeah.
You would have thought, gosh, I mean, you had the website first, Tough Titty.
No. What happened is that they hadn't bought the domain name.
Yeah.
That was so. It was actually a Voice for Men who actually were the first people. It's an online organization. It's American for Men, and it's amazingly effective.
Yeah.
I came across that years ago, and I was so grateful for it because for the first time, Paul Elam was saying the most outrageous things. And people go, how can you say that? How can you say that? And he just said, but you can say anything you like about men. Why, when you say it about women, everybody's outraged? Absolutely. I still get into trouble with journalists all the time because you support men's rights. And I look at them and say, well, why? Why not? Well, why? It's men's rights and women's rights. They're our rights.
Yeah. Absolutely. And the way I look at it, because personally, I'd label myself as a men's rights activist.
I'm no ist.
Yeah, absolutely. But kind of the perspective I would sort of push back onto, particularly people like Jess Phillips, is that she's got a legal responsibility to be an advocate for men's rights. It's in her job description. It's in the House of Parliament's code of conduct.
You have to remember, people like Jess Phillips. They're the only thing you can say about Jess Phillips is that she's more to her to make outrageous statements for publicity purposes. Is really all she does.
Oh, she's in it for herself. First and foremost, absolutely.
And she I hope her children will grow up to be ashamed of her part in what she did to destroy family life and men.
Yes, that will be interesting. She keeps mentioning that they do go online a lot and kind of look at YouTube videos about her. So yeah, that's going to be interesting. Who knows? Maybe one day they may even hear this podcast. Anyway, thank you for listening, and my thanks once again to the wonderful Erin Pizzey for taking the time to talk to me. As promised, amongst the links you will find in the show notes will be a link to Erin's website, so why not make honest-ribbon.org your next immediate destination. The week after this interview was recorded, I ended up having a follow-up chat with Erin specifically about that website after discovering that career feminist Laura Bates had made some absolutely outrageous claims about it. So I'll also include a link to that video and to one where I debunk yet another claim about her website, this time by Helen Lewis, the former deputy editor of the New Statesman, who Erin had been kind enough to invite into her home and talk to her for her recent book. If you've made it this far, then you've obviously got something out of something, so why not show your support for this channel by pressing like, subscribe, and by leaving a comment, and by sharing this podcast with a friend. And as always, remember to trust your instinct, and if you see an elephant...
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.
The Glass Blind Spot is brought to you by you, because it's your views, your likes and your comments that keep this show on the road.